An introduction to genre theory. Daniel Chandler. The problem of definition. A number of perennial doubts plague genre the theory. Are genres really out there in the world, or are they merely the constructions of analysts? Is there a finite taxonomy of genres, or are they in principle infinite? Are genres timeless platonic essences or ephemeral time-bound entities? Are genres culture-bound or transcultural? Should genre analysis be descriptive of or prescriptive? The word genre comes from the French and originally Latin word for kind or class. The term is widely used in rhetoric, literary theory, media theory, and more recently linguistics to refer to a distinctive type of text. Robert Allen notes that the most of its 2000 years genre study has been primarily nomenological and typological in function. That is to say, it has taken as its principal task the division of the world of literature into types and the naming of those types, much as the botanist divides the realm of flora into varieties of plants. As will be seen, however, the analogy with biological classification into genus and species misleadingly suggests a scientific process. Since classical times, literary works have been classified as belonging to general types which were variously defined. In literature, the broadest division is between poetry, prose, and drama, within which there are further divisions such as tragedy and comedy within the category of drama. Shakespeare referred satirically to classifications such as tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral comical, historical pastoral, tragical comical, historical pastoral, Hamlet. 2. In the anatomy of criticism, the formalism literary theories Northrop Frye presented certain universal genres and modes as the key to organizing the entire literary corpus. Contemporary media genres tend to relate more to specific forms than to the universals of tragedy and comedy. Nowadays, films are routinely classified in television listings, magazines as trailers, westerns, and so on, genres with which every adult modern society is familiar. So too with the television genres such as game shows and sitcoms. While we have names for countless genres in many media, some theorists have argued that there are also many genres and subgenres for which we have no names. Caroline Miller suggests that the number of genres in any society depends on the complexity and diversity of society. The classification and hierarchical taxonomy of genres is not a neutral and objective procedure. There are no undisputed maps of the system of genres within any medium, though literature may perhaps lay some claim to a loose consensus. Furthermore, there is often considerable theoretical disagreement disagreement about the definition of specific genders. A gender is ultimately an abstract conception rather than something that exists empirically in the world. Notes Jan Fewer. One theorist gender may be another subgenre or even supergenre, and indeed what is technical style, mode, formula, or thematic grouping to one may be treated as a genre by another. Themes at least seem inadequate as a basis for defining gender science, as David Bordwell notes. Any theme may appear in any genre. He asks, are animation and documentary films genres or modes? In the filmed or play or comedy performance, a genre. If the filmed play or comedy performance, a genre. If tragedy and comedy are genres, perhaps the domestic tragic or slapstick is a formula. In passing, he offers a useful inventory of categories used in film criticism, many of which have been accorded the status of genres by various commentators. Grouping by period or country, American films of the 30s by directors or star, or producer or writer or studio by technical process. Cinematoscope films by cycle, the Fallen Woman films by series, the 007 movies by the style, German expressionism by structure, narrative by ideology, reagent cinema by venue, drivers in movies by purpose, home movies by audience, 10 picks by subject or theme, family films, paranoid politic movies, etc. Bordwell, 1809. Another film theorist, Robert Stan, also refers to common ways of categorizing films. While some genres are based on story content, the war film. Others are borrowed from literature, comedy, melodrama, or from other media, the musical. Some are performer-based, the Astari Roger films, or budget-based blockbusters, while others are based on artistic status, the art films, racial identity, black cinema, location, the western or sexual orientation, queer cinema. Stamp 2000. Borwell concludes that one could argue that no set of necessary and sufficient conditions can mark off genres from other sort of groupings in ways that all experts of or ordinary film goers would find acceptable. Practitioners and the general public make use of their own genre labels, de facto genres, quite apart from those of academic theorists. We might therefore ask ourselves, those genres it is anyway. Whose genres it is anyway. Still further problems with definitional approaches will become apparent in due course. Defining genres may not initially seem particularly problematic, but it should already be apparent that it is a theoretical minefield. Robert Stan identifies 4 key problems with generic labels in relation to film: extension, the breadth or narrowness of labels, normativism, having preconceived ideas or of criteria for genre membership, monolithic definition as if item belonged to only one genre, biology, a kind of essentialism in which genres are seen as evolving through a standardized life cycle. Stam 2000. Conventional definitions of genres tend to be based on the notion that they constitute particular conventions of content, such as themes or settings, and or forms including structure and style, which are shared by the texts which are regarded as belonging to them. Alternative characterizations will be discussed in due course. The attempt to define particular genres in terms of necessary and sufficient textual properties is something seems as theoretically attractive, but it poses many difficulties. For instance, in the case of films, some seem to be aligned with one genre in content and another genre in form. The film theorist Sir Robert Stan argues that subject matter is the weakest criterion for genetic grouping because it fails to take into account how the subject is treated, outlining a fundamental problem of genre identification in relation to film. Andrew Tudor notes the empiricist dilemma. To take a genre such as Western, analyze it, and list its principal characteristics is to beg the question that we must first isolate the body of films which are Westerns, but they can only be isolated on the basis of the principal characteristics, which can only be discovered from the films themselves after they have been isolated. It is seldom hard to find texts which are exceptions to give any definition of a particular genre. There are no rigid rules to inclusion and exclusions. Genres are not discrete systems consisting of a fixed number of listable items. It is difficult to make clear-cut distinctions between one genre and another. Genres overlap, and there are mixed genres such as comedy thrillers. Specific genres tend to be easy to recognize intuitively, but difficult if not possible to define. Particular features which are characteristic of a genre are not normally unique to it. It is their relative prominence, combination, and functions which are distinctive. It is easy to underplay the differences within a genre. Steve Neil declares too that genres are instances to reception and difference. He adds that difference is absolutely essential to the economy of genre. Mere reception will not attract an audience. Svetan Stodorov argued that any instance of a genre will be necessarily different, cited in Gledhill in 1985. John Hartley notes that the action of just one film to the Western genre changed that the genre as a whole, even though the Western in question may display few of reorganized conventions, styles, or subject matter traditionally associated with this genre. The issue of difference also highlights the fact that some genres are losers, more open-ended in their conventions, or more permeable in their boundaries that same text that others. Texts often exhibit the conventions of more than one genre. John Hadley notes that the same text can belong to different genres in different countries or times. Hybrid genders abound, at least outside theoretical frameworks. Van Leeuwen suggests that the multiple purpose of journalism often leads to generically heterogeneous texts, cited in Fairclough. Norman Fairclough suggests that mixed genders texts are far from uncommon in the mass media. Some media may encourage more generic diversity. Nicholas Abercrombie notes that since the television comes at the audience and as a flow of programs, all with different generic conversations, means that it's more difficult to sustain the purity of the gender in the viewing experience. Furthermore, in any medium, the generic classification of certain texts may be uncertain or subject to dispute. Contemporary theories tend to describe genders in terms of family resemblance among texts, a notion derived from the philosopher Wittgenstein, rather than definitionally. Contemporary theories tend to describe genders in terms of family resemblances among texts, a notion derived from the philosopher Wittgenstein. Rather than definitionally, an individual text within a gender rarely, if ever, has all of the characteristic features of the gender. The family resemblance approaches involves the theories illustrating similarities between some of the texts within a gender. However, the family resemblance approach has been criticized on the basis that no choice of a text for illustrative purpose is innocent, and that such theories can make any text seem to resemble any other one. In addition to the definitional and family resemblance approach, there is another approach to describing genders which is based on the psycholinguistic concept of prototypically. According to this approach, some texts will be widely regarded as being more typical members of a gender than others. According to this approach, certain features will identify the extent to which an exemplar of prototypical of a particular gender. Genders can therefore be seen as fuzzy categories which cannot defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. How we define a gender depends on our purposes. The adequacy of our definition in terms of social science at least must surely be related to the light that the exploration sheds on the phenomena. For instance, and this is a key concern of mine, if we are studying the way in which genders frames the reader's interpretation of a text, then we will do well to focus on how readers identify genders rather than on theoretical distinctions. Defining genders may be problematic, but even in theorists were to abandon the concept in everyday life, people will continue to categorize texts. John Wallis does not that the discourse community's nomenclature for gender is an important source of insight. Swells 90. Though, like many academic theorists, he later adds that such gender names typically need further validation. Some genre names would be like to be more widely used than others. It will be interesting to investigate the areas of popular consensus and dissensus in relation to the everyday labeling of mass media genres. For Robert Hodge and Gunther Chris, genres only exist insofar as social groups declare and enforce the rules that constitute them. Though it is debatable to that extent, most of us will be able to formulate explicit rules for the textual genres where we use routinely. Much of our genre knowledge is likely to be tacit. In relation to film, Andrew Tudor argued that genre is what we collectively believe it to be. Through this begs the question about who we are. Robert Allen comments weirdly that Tudor even hints that in order to establish that audience expect a Western to be like, we may have to ask them. Swells also alludes to people having peremptories repertories of genres, which I will argue will also be likely to repay investigation. However, as David Buckingham notes, there has hardly been any empirical research on the ways in which real audience may understand genre or use this understanding in making sense of specific tests. Steve Neal stresses that genres are not systems, they are processes of systematization. Traditionally, genres, particularly literature genres, tended to be regarded as fixed forms, but contemporary theory emphasizes that both their forms and functions are dynamic. David Buckingham argued that genre is not simply given by culture, rather it is in constant process of negotiation and change. Nicholas Abercrombie suggests that Nicholas Abercrombie notes that since television comes at the audience as a flow of programs, all with different generic conventions, mean that it is more difficult to sustain the purity of the genre in the viewing experience. Nicholas Abercrombie suggests that the boundaries between genres and shifting and becoming more permeable. Abercrombie is concerned with modern television, which he suggests seems to be engaged in steady dismantling of genre, which can be attributed in part to economic pressures to pursue new audience. One may acknowledge by dynamic fluidity of genres without position the final demise of genre as interpretive frameworks. As the generic corpus ceaselessly spans, genres and the relationships between them change over time. The conventions of each genre shift, new genres and subgenres emerge, and others are discontinued. Thought not that certain genres seems particularly long-lasting. Svensson Todorov argued that a new genre is always the transformation of one or several old genres, cited Swells in 90. Each new york within a genre has the potential to influence changes within the genre, or perhaps the emerge of new subgenres. which might later blossom into fully fledged genres. However, such a perspective tends to highlight the role of authorial experimentation in changing genres and their conventions, whereas it is important to recognize not only the social structure of text production, but especially the role of economic and technological factors, as well as changing audience preferences. The interaction between genres and media can be seen as one of the forces which contributes to changing genres. Some genres are more powerful than others. They differ in the status which is attributed to them by those who produce texts within them and by their audiences. As Tony Twites put it in the interaction and conflict among genres, we can see the connections between textuality and power. The key genres in institutions which are primary definers, shows such as news reports in the mass media, helps to establish the frameworks within which issues are defined. But gender hierarchies also shift over time, with individual genders constantly gaining and losing different groups of users and relative status. Idealist theoretical approaches to gender which seeks to categorize ideal types in terms of essential textual characteristics are ahistorical. As a result of their dynamic nature of processes, Niels argues that definitions of genres are always historically relative and therefore historically specific. Similarly, Boris Tomaszewski insists that no firm's logical classification of gender is possible. Their marcation is always historical, that is to say, it is correct. Is to say it is correct only for a specific moment of history, cited by Bordel in 89. Some genres are defined only retrospectively, being unrecognized as such by the original producers and the audience. Genres need to be studied as a historical phenomenon, a popular focus in film studies. For instance, as has been the evolution of conventions within a genre. Current genres to go through phases or cycles of popularity, such as the cycle of disaster films in the 70s, sometimes becoming dormant for a period rather than disappearing. Ongoing genres and their conventions themselves change over time, reviewing evolutionarily changing some popular film genres. Andrew Tudor concludes that it has three main characteristics.